For 19 years, the production floor was more than a workplace to me. It was an extension of my body. I could identify a misaligned belt by sound, detect overheating motors by smell, and predict welding flaws long before they appeared. Every corner of the plant echoed with memories of decisions I made not by guesswork, but by instinct earned through sweat. I was there when leadership flirted with automation trends, when steel prices fluctuated, and when half the staff quit during a union conflict. Through every storm, I kept the plant profitable by balancing discipline with practicality. No spreadsheet ever repaired a jammed conveyor belt at 3 a.m, but I did more times than I could count. Then came the day everything changed. The owner walked in with his son, a man whose suit was worth more than the monthly salary of the welders standing behind me. His polished shoes had never stepped on a greasy floor, yet he carried himself as though the machines owed him respect. He had an MBA, 3 letters he believed made him invincible. He introduced himself with a confident smile, claiming he was here to modernize operations. The welders exchanged glances. I stayed silent, giving him the benefit of experience I assumed he lacked. In his first presentation, he unveiled a single Excel sheet projected across the conference room wall. He called it the roadmap to efficiency. According to his formulas, production could double in 6 months. He labeled break times as unnecessary, maintenance cycles as bloated, and safety checks as schedule inhibitors. Every cell in that spreadsheet dismissed the human element of manufacturing like it was a pesky afterthought. He spoke as though machines were obedient soldiers and workers were programmable assets. The board members nodded along, dazzled by colorful graphs, mesmerized by vocabulary they didn't understand. I raised one concern. Welders were already operating at maximum safe capacity. Extending their hours would increase fatigue, and fatigue meant mistakes. Mistakes in manufacturing aren't typos. They're injuries, product recalls, or lawsuits waiting to happen. The owner's son waved my comment aside and smiled condescendingly, insisting that older employees often resisted progress. His spreadsheet proved the system could be optimized. To him, decades of experience were irrelevant because they weren't formatted into a cell he could sort alphabetically. Overnight, everything I had built began to unravel. The new plan eliminated the maintenance schedule I designed, claiming machines could handle the load. Anyone who understood engines knew metal didn't respond to optimism. It responded to pressure, heat, and time. For the first time in my career, welders ignored my instructions because the MBA's charts told them otherwise. Management instructed me to align my decisions with the spreadsheet, as though physics would bend if someone adjusted a formula. My signature, once the stamp that kept production legal and safe, became a mere formality. The atmosphere on the floor shifted. Workers who once sought my guidance now feared questioning the new regime. The younger staff admired the glossy diagrams, unaware that a factory isn't built on aesthetics. A spreadsheet can predict hypothetical futures, but it can't feel vibrations from a motor about to seize. I watched men I trained turn into data points and processes I perfected become obsolete lines on a graph. What bothered me wasn't the challenge to my authority. I had weathered challenges before. What shook me was how quickly a legacy could be dismissed by someone who never cleaned coolant from a blade or replaced bearings in winter without heating. The plant I had saved from bankruptcy twice now felt like a courtroom, except the trial was rigged before I spoke. Every decision I made became evidence of resistance. Every warning I offered became proof of stubbornness. I didn't realize it then, but the spreadsheet that dismissed my life's work wasn't my ending. It was the fuse. Something was building quietly behind every ignored warning. The numbers he worshipped were about to face something they couldn't calculate: consequences. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m, but by 8:30, the boardroom was already packed. Directors who rarely stepped foot on the production floor suddenly appeared, dressed in tailored suits and wearing expressions that suggested something monumental was about to happen. My name was whispered in corners, not out of respect, but anticipation, like the audience waiting for a magician's final act. For nearly 2 decades, my opinion shaped every decision that kept the plant alive. I assumed my voice still mattered. I was wrong. The owner's son stood at the head of the room, laptop open, sleeves rolled up as if he had just finished wrestling with machinery instead of formatting cells on a screen. The moment the projector lit up with a cascade of graphs, buzzwords, and neon charts, he transformed from an inexperienced newcomer into a self-proclaimed prophet. He called his plan a manufacturing renaissance and spoke as if he had discovered electricity. His spreadsheet promised dazzling figures: labor costs cut in half, productivity doubled, downtime erased entirely. Not a single calculation accounted for human exhaustion, machine tolerance, or real-world setbacks. It was perfect because it existed only in theory. As he continued, the board nodded rhythmically, hypnotized by statistics they didn't understand. The factory's oldest machine alone required more time to warm up than his model allowed for an entire production run, but none of that mattered. His tone, polished and confident, masked the fact that he had never lifted a wrench. When he claimed that welders could complete complex joints in half the usual time, some directors clapped. They had forgotten that steel cools at its own pace, unaffected by enthusiasm. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I outlined the operational risks: increased strain on conveyor belts, overheating motors due to shortened rest cycles, weld consistency compromised by unrealistic pacing, and the insurance nightmare that would erupt once someone got injured. I reminded them of the fire we narrowly avoided years ago because maintenance protocols caught a fault early. The room remained silent, not because they disagreed, but because my words didn't sparkle like his graphs. The MBA leaned back in his chair and gave me a smile that wasn't friendly. It was a smile that dismissed history. He referred to my objections as emotional conservatism, implying that decades of field knowledge were merely feelings. He said the future required courage to disrupt old habits, as if repairing machines under freezing conditions at 3 a.m. had been a hobby. To him, I wasn't a craftsman. I was a relic. Several board members exchanged glances, eager to latch onto a modern narrative. Innovation photographs well on annual reports. Experience looks old and tired. The owner, once my ally, now seemed embarrassed to be associated with manual know-how. The more I warned them, the more they nodded at him. It didn't matter that my methods kept them profitable through economic downturns. His spreadsheet wore the disguise of inevitability, and they were desperate to believe it. Then came the turning point. He projected a slide titled Legacy Barriers, and under it appeared my name, bold, centered, unmistakable. According to his chart, I was the reason the plant couldn't expand. My insistence on safety checks slowed progress. My maintenance schedules wasted time. My caution, which saved the company millions, was reframed as stagnation. The room filled with uncomfortable silence, yet no one defended me. They watched a man who never cleaned grease off his hands redefine my life's work in a single click. By the time the meeting ended, the verdict had been delivered without ceremony. My badge was deactivated before sunset. The hallway I once walked like a commander now felt foreign. I entered the building that morning as the man who had kept the factory alive. I left it labeled as dead weight. The same hands that rescued machines from collapse were now dismissed because they couldn't be summarized in a spreadsheet column. That night, as I packed my toolbox, it struck me, I wasn't fired for incompetence. I was fired for not fitting into a formula created by someone who believed numbers were more reliable than people. They didn't understand the danger of replacing wisdom with shortcuts. They believed progress came from deleting the past. They had no idea what they had unleashed. But consequences don't vanish. They collect. And soon, the spreadsheet that erased me would demand payment. The first week after my departure felt like a victory lap for the MBA's grand experiment. Supervisors boasted about new productivity records, and the board circulated congratulatory emails. According to the spreadsheet, the factory had unlocked a level of efficiency previously thought impossible. Workstations operated at full speed without interruptions. Machines that once rested between cycles now ran continuously, as if steel and gears could be motivated by enthusiasm alone. Charts went up and applause followed, but no one seemed interested in stepping onto the production floor to see the price of their celebration. By the second week, the pressure began to show. Welders, now forced to meet impossible quotas, moved like machines themselves, fast, focused, and dangerously fatigued. Breaks became luxuries. Hydration was optional. Supervisors waved spreadsheets in their faces whenever someone slowed down. The welders didn't argue. They knew the new regime valued numbers over voices. The hum of machinery replaced conversation. The MBA had turned human expertise into disposable variables, convinced a formula could rewrite biology. Inventory soon spilled into spaces never intended for storage. Pallets blocked emergency exits. Raw materials cluttered the aisles, leaving forklifts navigating like blindfolded horses. Orders stacked faster than workers could fulfill them. On a screen, it looked like growth. In the factory, it looked like chaos. Without maintenance pauses, conveyor belts jittered from accumulated friction. Bearings screamed under strain. Motors heated beyond tolerance levels. The scent of burning oil floated across the floor like an omen no one wanted to acknowledge. Accidents, once rare under my protocols, became daily occurrences. Tiny sparks turned into unintended flames. Welds cracked at stress points because speed didn't allow metal to cool properly. Steel has its own rules. Rush it, and it retaliates. But the MBA didn't understand metallurgy. He understood margins. Injuries were dismissed as transitional hiccups, as though humans were prototypes. Safety officers, once empowered to halt operations, now submitted reports that landed directly in trash bins. Safety no longer protected workers. It protected spreadsheets from bad news. The delivery department suffered next. Trucks loaded late, often with incomplete orders. Drivers waited for hours because production ran behind schedule despite the illusion of speed. Clients grew impatient when shipments arrived with defects or missing parts. Some returned entire orders, furious at the declining quality. The MBA brushed complaints aside, citing projections that still showed profits. According to him, reality would adjust to the model, as though the market obeyed formulas instead of trust. Inside the plant, tension thickened. Experienced workers whispered that the machines were angry. It might have sounded superstitious to the executives, but on the floor, men who had worked decades knew when steel was stressed beyond its spirit. Machines vibrated harder, belts slipped more often, and the air felt hotter. It wasn't just mechanics failing, it was morale. Pride evaporated. People stopped caring because the system had stopped caring about them. By the fourth week, the furnace that powered part of the production line malfunctioned. It hadn't been shut down for recalibration, not once, since the MBA's plan went live. The sensors, ignored for days, finally gave up. The furnace overheated and molten material spilled onto the floor, damaging equipment worth more than the salary they refused to pay me. Workers scrambled to contain it while management accused them of incompetence. The furnace wasn't the only thing melting. Trust was disintegrating faster than steel at peak temperature. The factory's downfall no longer hid behind bar graphs and optimistic forecasts. Machines trembled under forced productivity. Workers trembled under exhaustion. The spreadsheet still displayed soaring numbers, but the factory floor told the truth in smoke, sweat, and broken parts. It became clear that mathematics had lost the argument, not because math was wrong, but because someone tried to treat reality as optional. A factory is not a theory. It is a living organism. Neglect its heartbeat, and it kills itself slowly. What the MBA didn't understand was that efficiency isn't achieved by deleting limits, it's achieved by respecting them. The plant might have looked like a masterpiece in his calculations, but every formula he celebrated carried a cost the machines would soon demand in full. The factory wasn't defying mathematics. It was punishing arrogance. 3 weeks after my departure, I was eating breakfast when my phone rang. The number on the screen belonged to the factory's main office. I hadn't expected a call so soon, certainly not after the board's confidence in their new prodigy. When I answered, the voice on the other end trembled. It wasn't a greeting, it was a plea. The plant wasn't just struggling, it was collapsing under the weight of its own illusions. Production lines were halted. The emergency alarm had been triggered twice in one morning. An order worth millions sat unfinished, and a key client had already threatened legal action. The metrics they once celebrated had turned into a ticking bomb. The first words I heard were not apologies. They were demands disguised as desperation. Machines had seized. Welds were failing inspection. Trucks were waiting outside with half-loaded pallets, burning fuel and patience. The spreadsheet that once promised prosperity had devolved into a liability that no formula could fix. They wanted me back, not as an employee, but as the man who understood the place better than anyone breathing. The MBA was there too, but he didn't speak. I could hear him nervously tapping keys in the background, as if rearranging formulas might reverse physics. I didn't rush to answer. I listened as department heads took turns detailing the catastrophe. Motors overheated because maintenance cycles had been erased. Welders worked double shifts to meet quotas that ignored metal fatigue. The furnace incident had cost them more than replacing the entire maintenance budget I once managed. Clients sent samples of cracked products back with notes accusing the company of fraud. A single defect can ruin a reputation, and now they had thousands. The board, once intoxicated by modern terminology, was now sober with fear. What struck me most wasn't the technical damage, it was the emotional aftermath. Workers who once joked about retirement plans were now terrified of losing their livelihoods. Men who spent half their lives inside that plant now feared the future more than broken machines. Some called me directly, their voices cracking as they begged me to return. They didn't need a consultant. They needed an anchor. My absence had revealed something the MBA's coursework never covered. Factories don't run on numbers, they run on people who believe in the work. Reluctance churned inside me. I didn't miss the politics, but I missed the hum of synchronized machinery. I missed the purpose. When machines fail for mechanical reasons, you can fix them. When they fail because someone replaced respect with arrogance, the damage runs deeper. I thought of the systems I designed, the safeguards I installed, the knowledge I shared. Watching it all crumble from a distance felt like witnessing a house fire built from what I chose myself. I wasn't angry, I was haunted. The MBA finally spoke. His voice cracked as he blamed timing, market volatility, and unforeseen circumstances, everything except himself. He didn't mention the spreadsheet that mocked decades of expertise. He didn't acknowledge that a factory isn't transformed by drag-and-drop cells. He sounded like a boy defending a broken toy he didn't know how to fix. He said they needed temporary adjustments, as though patching chaos with words could resurrect logic. That was when I realized why they truly called. They didn't want innovation. They wanted forgiveness without the admission of error. They wanted me to salvage the fragments of a legacy they had treated as outdated debris. Returning wouldn't be a victory lap. It would be triage. I agreed to visit, not because they begged, but because I couldn't stand the idea of innocent workers paying for someone else's delusions. As I hung up, a strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't anger. It was the bitter recognition that the disaster I predicted had finally landed, and the only person capable of stopping it was the one they dismissed. The spreadsheet didn't just break a system. It summoned its creator's reckoning. And now, they wanted me to clean up the mathematical mess that almost burned my legacy to ashes. When I stepped through the factory doors again, no announcement welcomed me. No handshake greeted my return. My name wasn't printed on any badge, yet every worker who glanced my way exhaled as though a storm had finally passed. They didn't need titles, banners, or speeches. They just needed stability, and in their eyes, I was the last person who understood how to summon it. The air felt heavy with exhaustion, machines groaned under strain, and the smell of burnt oil lingered like a scar. I took it all in without a word. This wasn't nostalgia, it was an autopsy. I didn't march toward the boardroom or ask to see the MBA. I headed straight to the production floor. The welders, once confident craftsmen, now moved with hesitation. Conveyor belts trembled from neglect, as though each rotation questioned its own existence. I ran my hand over the control panels I once calibrated, feeling scratches that hadn't been there before. Someone had forced these machines to pretend they were invincible, and metal doesn't lie. Instead of asking questions, I listened to what the machines were telling me. Their vibrations spoke louder than spreadsheets. I knew where to start. First came the schedules. They had been stretched beyond reason, ignoring cool-down windows and forcing machinery to operate in a state of permanent strain. I rebalanced the workflow, cutting processes that looked efficient only on paper. As I worked, supervisors hovered, unsure whether they were supposed to help or avoid interfering. I didn't need their permission. What I was fixing wasn't a plan, it was reality. Machines demand respect, not optimism. Then came the motors. They whined like tired lungs gasping for breath. Bearings were worn, lubrication cycles had been skipped, and temperature settings exceeded safety thresholds. I recalibrated them one by one, adjusting voltage, speed, and torque. The MBA watched from a distance, pale as chalk. He didn't dare approach. His formulas never taught him that a machine can rebel, that steel pushes back when mistreated. The noise of misalignment ceased, replaced by the steady hum I knew by heart. Workers noticed first. Hope flickered across their faces. As word spread that the machines were waking up, men who once avoided eye contact approached me quietly. They didn't apologize for staying silent when I was dismissed. They didn't need to. Their gratitude was visible in their posture. For the first time in weeks, they stood straight instead of shrinking under impossible demands. Trust wasn't restored through speeches, it was repaired with action. The furnace room came next. Once a symbol of controlled power, it now resembled a battlefield. Heat marks stained the walls, and gauges blinked warnings no one bothered to interpret. I shut it down, not permanently, but properly. Cooling it took hours, yet those hours saved the company from an explosion that would have destroyed more than machinery. The welders stayed nearby, watching like children who had nearly lost a parent. When the furnace sighed back into alignment, they clapped softly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if celebrated too loudly. By late afternoon, production resumed, not at the reckless pace the MBA promised, but at a rhythm the factory could sustain. Trucks were loaded again. Defects decreased. The heartbeat of the plant returned. No one needed graphs to confirm it, they could feel it in their bones. The MBA stood near the doorway, clutching a clipboard that suddenly looked like a child's toy. His spreadsheet didn't teach him humility. My presence did. What happened that day wasn't a comeback. It was restoration. A factory is like a loyal creature. It recognizes who feeds it and who starves it. When I left, it bled. When I returned, it breathed. Titles never made me valuable. Badges never granted me authority. What I carried was understanding, earned by years of listening to machines the same way others listened to mentors. And as the sun set, the plant wasn't the only thing returning to life. So was my legacy. In the weeks that followed my return, something remarkable happened. The factory found its pulse again. Production rose not in dizzying spikes fueled by reckless ambition, but in steady increments that aligned with reality. Each weld passed inspection. Each shipment left the premises on schedule. The machines hummed at a rhythm that felt familiar, almost grateful. No pep talks were needed. No graphs were displayed. The results spoke the language the plant understood, reliability. Clients who had threatened legal action suddenly shifted tone. They called, not with complaints, but with cautious optimism. Samples submitted for verification were now flawless, free of hairline cracks and structural inconsistencies. One major client, who had stopped returning calls entirely, sent a representative to deliver a message in person. Whatever you did, do not stop. That statement carried more weight than any certificate or press release. Trust, once fractured by arrogance, began to rebuild quietly. The board of directors, previously enamored with neon spreadsheets, took a different posture. Their glossy excitement had been replaced with humbled curiosity. They finally realized that numbers are tools, not commandments. Charts predicted possibilities, but it was intuition shaped by years of sweat and burned fingers that prevented disasters. You can quantify speed and cost, but you can't reduce experience to a percentage. There's no cell in Excel where you can drag and drop wisdom. It became obvious that the MBA's revolution had been cosmetic. His formulas were linear, factories are not. His projections assumed metal behaved like obedient software, when in reality, metal is stubborn, temperamental, and driven by physics, not ambition. A spreadsheet can calculate force, but it doesn't understand fatigue. It can track production, but it cannot feel heat or smell burning oil. That kind of comprehension isn't taught in universities, it is forged on the floor, one mistake at a time. Though the MBA kept his position, he lost the commodity he prized most: credibility. His once confident stride was replaced by cautious steps. The clipboard he carried like a badge of superiority now acted as a shield. He watched conversations shift away from buzzwords and toward execution. He was no longer the future he claimed to represent. He was a reminder of what happens when theory ignores reality. Workers who once whispered doubts about my methods approached me openly now. They didn't ask for orders, they asked for guidance. They began referring to me as the architect, a title I never sought, but one that reflected something deeper than authority. An architect doesn't just build, he understands the foundation. He respects weight distribution, stress points, and the unseen forces that keep structures upright. My work had never been about controlling people. It had always been about respecting the unseen mathematics of human effort. Small gestures spoke loudly. A welder who previously rushed through tasks took a moment to double-check a joint before sealing it. A forklift operator who used to race through aisles slowed down to avoid collisions. None of this came from fear of punishment. It came from a renewed respect for the process. When people understand why something matters, compliance becomes pride, not obligation. Investors noticed the shift too. Reports highlighted reduced defect rates, stable production cycles, and improved workforce morale. No one celebrated the comeback publicly, yet every stakeholder breathed easier. The plant, once a cautionary tale, was becoming a case study, one they wouldn't dare diminish with buzzwords again. Through it all, one truth emerged: business schools can teach leverage, projections, and market behavior. They can teach strategy, finance, and branding. But no institution can teach the instinct of a worker who has listened to the same machine for 19 years and knows when it sighs wrong. That instinct isn't learned, it is earned. The MBA had formulas. I had understanding. And the factory was finally learning which one kept the lights on. 2 months after stabilizing the factory, I realized something unexpected. I no longer belonged inside one building. The systems I had revived were strong, the workers confident, and the leadership humbled. Staying would mean returning to routines that no longer challenged me. The factory was breathing again, but I felt something else awakening inside me, a desire to build, advise, and shape industries beyond the walls that once defined my identity. So, without drama, I resigned. My departure didn't leave a hole. It left a blueprint. Word traveled faster than I imagined. By the end of the first week, 3 factories, competitors of my former employer, reached out, eager to meet. These companies had heard not just the story of the spreadsheet fiasco, but how I had resurrected a failing plant without shouting, threatening, or hiding behind jargon. They didn't care about titles or appearances. They didn't want presentations. They wanted solutions forged in sweat and verified by outcomes. During my first consultation, the plant manager didn't shake my hand like a guest. He greeted me like someone who finally found the missing part for an impossible machine. He gave me a tour, pointing out production issues with the nervousness of someone exposing scars. I listened carefully, as I always had. Machines are like people. They confess their problems to those who understand their language. Within hours, I knew what needed fixing. Not because of theory, but because the metal spoke, and I understood its dialect. My rate shocked them at first. Charging more per hour than what I once earned in a week wasn't arrogance. It was justice overdue. I didn't negotiate. I had spent 2 decades proving my worth in silence. Now, experience carried a price. They paid without complaint, because cost is never excessive when competence is the product. What they received wasn't advice, it was stability. Factory after factory revealed the same story: executives obsessed with graphs, analysts who believed work was a concept, not a craft, and managers who trusted colorful charts more than human skill. They all had the same disease: blind faith in numbers stripped of context. And each time I entered a new facility, workers stared the way they might look at a doctor arriving after years of misdiagnosis. They didn't know me personally, yet somehow, they recognized what I represented. In one plant, the conveyor line trembled as if afraid of being judged. In another, the welding stations were operated like ticking bombs, managed by men terrified of making mistakes. Yet as soon as I recalibrated a furnace or adjusted a timing sequence, shoulders relaxed. The machines responded like animals returning to an owner they trusted. It wasn't magic. It was the craft business schools refused to acknowledge, understanding how steel behaves under stress, how torque shifts with age, how precision lives in the space between measurements. Meanwhile, the MBA watched from afar as my reputation grew. He kept his job, but his name became a cautionary tale whispered across break rooms. His spreadsheet hadn't erased me, it introduced me. It clarified a truth executives forgot. The world doesn't admire those who predict change. It admires those who repair what others break. My departure didn't mark an ending. It marked a beginning he unknowingly sponsored. Soon, industry newsletters began referring to me as the manufacturing father. At first, I rejected the title. I wasn't a patriarch. I was a worker who refused to let arrogance rewrite physics. But the name stuck, not because I demanded it, but because factories across the region used my methods to prevent chaos. Every machine recalibrated under my supervision became a chapter in a story the MBA never intended to write. I didn't chase revenge, status, or applause. I built something simpler, respect rooted in proof. In a world that celebrates theories, I represented what everyone forgot: results. And as each new factory welcomed me, one truth echoed louder: spreadsheets can predict possibilities. Men like me ensure those possibilities don't collapse. In the end, my firing turned out to be the most profitable event of my life. The men who once praised my dedication had believed they were ushering in a future too advanced for someone like me. They spoke of modernization as if it were a religion and spreadsheets as if they were sacred texts. When they let me go, they expected me to fade quietly into retirement, carrying memories instead of ambition. What they never anticipated was that the very tool used to dismiss me would become the symbol of my resurrection. My story spread through the manufacturing world like a whispered warning. Executives who once scoffed at manual expertise now studied it like survival doctrine. Plant managers referenced my departure as a turning point, a real-world case study that exposed the difference between efficiency on paper and efficiency welded into existence. The lessons I had embodied for decades were no longer dismissed as stubborn tradition. They became priceless assets. Those who understood machines came seeking my guidance. Those who ignored them paid dearly. As my consultancy grew, I traveled to factories across different regions. Some had cutting-edge equipment, others relied on machines old enough to tell stories. Yet they all shared the same problem: leaders who tried to control machinery with assumptions instead of respect. In boardrooms where I once sat unheard, I now stood at the head of the table, requested by name. I didn't beg for relevance. I invoiced for it. Clients paid hourly rates that once would have embarrassed me. Now those numbers represented something bigger: validation. Engineers asked questions with humility. Welders listened with reverence. Executives treated my presence as an insurance policy against their own ignorance. They didn't want speeches or theories. They wanted someone who could prevent disaster before it appeared in quarterly reports. My expertise wasn't an accessory, it was armor. Factories that once paraded digital dashboards discovered that no algorithm could predict the personality of a machine aging under heat or a conveyor belt fatigued by years of misalignment. They learned efficiency isn't born from shortcuts, it's earned from knowing when to accelerate, when to pause, and when to shut everything down before a furnace explodes. Profit follows respect. Respect follows understanding. Understanding is born from time, not templates. Meanwhile, the MBA remained at my former company. His spreadsheet still existed somewhere, filled with hopes, gradients, and predictions detached from reality. But the awe he once commanded had evaporated. Staff who once admired him now treated him like a reminder of what happens when ambition outruns experience. He wasn't fired. He wasn't punished. He lived something far worse: irrelevance. Numbers lose their power when the hands guiding them don't know what they touch. The company that dismissed me eventually reached out again, not to apologize, but to inquire about hiring me back under a consultancy contract. Their tone had changed. Gone were the buzzwords. Gone were the promises of innovation. All that remained was a request wrapped in regret. I didn't refuse out of spite. I refused because you don't rebuild foundations with the same blueprint that cracked them. What they failed to understand was simple: modernization isn't an enemy of tradition. It is its student. Innovation only thrives when it respects the past that carried it forward. A spreadsheet can predict motion, but it cannot understand rotation. Wheels don't obey formulas. They obey physics. And men who ignore physics eventually get run over by it. Today, I sign contracts worth more than the annual bonuses of every executive who once doubted me. My overalls hang untouched, not because I outgrew them, but because they remind me where truth is forged. In the language of industry, I didn't upgrade, I evolved. The MBA kept his spreadsheet. I kept my legacy. One recorded numbers. The other recorded consequences. And in business, consequences always collect the final payment.